On 18 April 1945. In a quiet office inside the White House, Harry S. Truman sat alone, shoulders heavy, eyes fixed on a map of Europe, where red and blue arrows pressed toward a single word, Berlin. The room smelled faintly of paper and tobacco, the curtains drawn against a gray Washington morning. As Truman, only days into the presidency, absorbed the reality that victory no longer meant peace. Franklin Roosevelt was gone, the war was nearly won. Yet the future was narrowing fast. And every mile east carried consequences that would last generations. Across the Atlantic, American armies moved through the ruins of Germany. Towns broken, civilians hollow-eyed. Roads choked with refugees. While radios crackled with updates measured in miles and hours. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm on the surface, calculated endlessly, weighing lives against lines on a map, knowing that the race to Berlin was no longer only about defeating Hitler. The Soviets were coming fast from the east. Their losses unimaginable, their determination absolute. And everyone at SHAEF understood what first contact with Berlin would symbolize. On 12 April 1945, when Truman took the oath, he inherited not just a war, but a clock, ticking louder with every report from the front. American leaders spoke carefully, privately, their words shaped by fear of another war forming inside the victory of this one. To rush Berlin meant tens of thousands of American dead. To stop short meant conceding the heart of Europe. And neither option felt clean. In Paris, in London, in Washington, the same question echoed behind closed doors. Who would shape the world after the guns fell silent? Maps were folded, cigarettes burned low, and decisions hardened, as the race to Berlin turned from military movement into political destiny. By nightfall, Truman understood something Roosevelt had carried for years. The end of this war would decide the beginning of the next. On 20 April 1945, as Adolf Hitler marked his final birthday deep beneath Berlin, American leaders followed a different ritual, studying fresh intelligence reports that narrowed the gap between armies and inevitability. In Eisenhower's headquarters near Reims, the mood was tense but disciplined. Maps spread wide, pins moved carefully, every adjustment representing lives that would not come home. The Red Army was less than 40 miles from Berlin, their artillery already shaking the outskirts. And the question inside Allied command was no longer if, but who. Eisenhower spoke plainly to his staff, his voice steady, his expression controlled, as he outlined a truth few wanted to accept. Berlin was a political prize wrapped in a military nightmare. American generals knew the city had been fortified for a last stand. Streets turned into killing zones. Civilians trapped between ideology and collapse. While Soviet losses mounted with brutal speed. To race east would satisfy headlines, but it would also bleed divisions dry. Just weeks before the war's natural end. In Washington, Truman listened more than he spoke, absorbing cables heavy with consequence, learning how power was exercised not through speeches, but through restraint. Advisors warned him that Stalin had already paid the price for Berlin in blood, that denying it now could fracture the alliance before peace even began. Yet others argued that surrendering Berlin without contest meant surrendering leverage, shaping a post-war Europe tilted east before negotiations ever began. On 23 April 1945, Eisenhower sent his message. Firm, measured, irreversible. American forces would not make a direct drive on Berlin. The decision rippled instantly. Through British command, through Soviet channels, through the quiet corridors of Washington, where leaders understood history had just pivoted. This was not retreat, it was calculation. An admission that the war had transformed into something colder, sharper, and far longer. As American troops turned south toward Bavaria, the guns kept firing. But the silence after Berlin's fall was already being imagined. The race was ending, yet the competition was only beginning. And American leaders knew the words spoken now would echo far beyond victory. On 25 April 1945, at the ruined town of Torgau on the Elbe River, American and Soviet soldiers met at last. Hands clasped over shattered stone. While cameras captured a moment already heavy with irony. The smiles were real, the relief unmistakable. Yet behind the handshakes, American officers watched closely, aware that this meeting line was also a dividing line. For Washington, this contact confirmed what leaders feared and accepted. The race to Berlin had been decided without them. General Omar Bradley reflected quietly that day, noting how swiftly allies could become rivals. Once a common enemy vanished into rubble, American leaders spoke publicly of unity, of shared sacrifice, while privately acknowledging that Europe's future was now being written in two different languages. Every mile the Red Army held was a fact no speech could undo, no promise could erase. In Berlin, the city burned, Soviet artillery pounded block by block. And reports described desperation so complete it bordered on madness. From afar, Truman read summaries stripped of emotion. Yet each line carried the weight of civilians crushed between collapsing walls and collapsing ideologies. He understood that American absence from Berlin spared lives, but cost influence, a trade no one could fully measure yet. On 28 April 1945, intelligence confirmed Hitler would not escape, and with that knowledge, American leaders shifted their focus from conquest to control. The war in Europe was ending. But order had to follow chaos. And chaos ruled wherever armies stopped. Occupation zones, supply corridors, displaced millions, all demanded decisions made faster than diplomacy preferred. Eisenhower warned that misunderstanding now could harden into borders later. His words cautious, his meaning unmistakable. The Soviets spoke of liberation. Americans spoke of stability. And both believed history would judge them favorably. Between those beliefs, a silent competition took shape. Invisible to soldiers celebrating the end of combat. As April closed, American leaders sensed the truth settling in. Berlin was lost, but the peace was still unwon. The race had revealed not weakness, but the cost of restraint. And restraint would soon be tested again. On 2 May 1945, as Berlin finally fell silent under Soviet control, American leaders received confirmation not with celebration, but with a quiet, uneasy acknowledgement of what that silence meant. The city had surrendered, Hitler was dead. And the flags now rising over Berlin signaled not just victory, but ownership of the future. In Washington, Truman closed his briefing folder slowly, understanding that the end of fighting did not end the struggle. Across Germany, American forces paused. Their advance complete, their orders clear. Hold position, stabilize, prepare for occupation. General Eisenhower reminded his commanders that discipline now mattered more than speed. That how America behaved in victory would define its moral authority. Soldiers who had expected to push onward instead became administrators, guardians of a shattered land. On 4 May 1945, reports arrived detailing the scale of destruction inside Berlin. Entire districts flattened, civilians reduced to survival, and Soviet losses staggering beyond comprehension. American leaders spoke carefully about the city, avoiding triumph or criticism, knowing every word carried diplomatic weight. Privately, many wondered how such devastation would shape the Soviet mindset. Hardened by sacrifice, suspicious of restraint, Truman's advisors debated the next phase relentlessly. The question no longer about Germany, but about Europe as a whole. Where American trucks rolled in the West, food and order followed, while in the East, authority arrived first, and mercy came later, if at all. These contrasts were observed, recorded, and quietly reported back to Washington. On 7 May 1945, Germany signed its surrender, and church bells rang across Allied capitals. Yet American leaders felt no illusion of finality. Victory speeches were drafted, then softened, stripped of language that might provoke the next conflict before peace had begun. Truman spoke of responsibility, not conquest, signaling that America would shape the aftermath with care, not vengeance. As celebrations erupted in the streets, strategy continued in silence. The race to Berlin was over, but a deeper contest had already begun. Fought not with tanks, but with influence, patience, and resolve. On 8 May 1945, as victory in Europe was declared, American leaders watched celebrations unfold from a distance, aware that joy and uncertainty were arriving together. Crowds filled streets in New York and London. But inside government offices, the maps remained open, the pencils still moving, the future unresolved. For Truman, this was a victory inherited, not concluded. And the responsibilities ahead felt heavier than the war just ended. In Germany, American commanders faced a country hollowed out by ideology and bombardment. Its people exhausted, its institutions collapsed. General Eisenhower insisted that compassion must walk alongside control, that hunger and chaos could breed another catastrophe if ignored. Food shipments, medical aid, and strict discipline became weapons of peace, deployed carefully across the western zones. On 10 May 1945, intelligence briefings shifted tone, focusing less on German resistance and more on Soviet behavior. Reports described rapid consolidation in the east, arrests, relocations, and the installation of loyal administrations, all carried out with relentless efficiency. American leaders read these accounts without comment. Yet their silence reflected growing concern. Truman's inner circle debated how firmly to speak to Moscow, weighing alliance against autonomy, cooperation against caution. The president understood that American words now needed steel behind them, or they would fade into courtesy. Every message sent east was crafted to signal resolve without confrontation, a balance that grew harder by the day. Meanwhile, American soldiers encountered displaced persons by the millions. Survivors of camps, forced laborers, families with nowhere left to return. These human encounters shaped opinions faster than any briefing, reminding leaders that ideology mattered less to civilians than safety and dignity. The contrast between liberation and occupation became impossible to ignore. As May wore on, American leaders realized the race to Berlin had simply revealed a deeper truth. The war had ended, but the world was dividing. And the lines were already being drawn. Quietly, deliberately, and with lasting consequence. On 12 May 1945, with Europe officially at peace, American leaders turned their full attention to the silence that followed. A silence filled with unanswered questions. The guns had stopped, yet reports kept arriving, describing movements, meetings, and intentions that hinted at a new kind of struggle. For Truman, peace felt provisional, like a pause before another test of will. In Berlin, now firmly under Soviet control, American military missions were limited, observed, and quietly constrained. Officers reported an atmosphere of suspicion, of watchful cooperation that felt brittle beneath the surface. What had once been alliance now required translation, explanation, and constant reassurance. On 15 May 1945, American diplomats began pushing for clarity on occupation agreements, borders, and political freedoms promised earlier in the war. The responses from Moscow were polite, firm, and increasingly noncommittal, a tone that troubled Washington deeply. Every delayed answer felt like ground quietly slipping away. General Eisenhower warned Truman that military goodwill could not substitute for political agreement. His language careful, his concern unmistakable. He had commanded coalition warfare, but he understood that coalitions rarely survived victory unchanged. The discipline that held armies together did not bind ideologies. American leaders spoke often of patience, yet prepared for endurance. They authorized long-term troop deployments, logistical networks, and intelligence structures designed not for months, but for years. The idea of withdrawing completely from Europe began to fade, replaced by a recognition of obligation. On the ground, American soldiers sensed the shift instinctively. Checkpoints hardened, briefings grew more guarded, and conversations with Soviet counterparts shortened, smiles fading faster than before. The war's end had not brought simplicity, only complexity of a different kind. By mid-May, American leaders accepted a reality they had hoped to avoid. The race to Berlin had ended in restraint. But the peace that followed demanded resolve. And resolve would now define America's role in the world. On 20 May 1945, as spring settled over a broken continent, American leaders gathered their thoughts around a single concern: how quickly friendship had turned into formality. The language of wartime unity still echoed in speeches. Yet behind closed doors, expectations hardened, and trust thinned with each exchange. Victory had removed the glue that once held the alliance together. In Washington, Truman studied memoranda describing Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe, noting patterns rather than promises. Elections delayed, opposition silenced. Borders tightened, all actions justified as security, yet felt like permanence. American leaders understood that influence surrendered rarely returned. On 23 May 1945, German officials were arrested. Regimes dissolved, and power transferred, but not uniformly. Where American forces oversaw transitions, local voices were cautiously restored. While in Soviet zones, authority flowed from the top down. These differences became the quiet evidence shaping future policy. General George Marshall urged consistency, reminding Truman that strength without clarity invited miscalculation. Aid, presence, and commitment had to be visible, or Europe would drift toward the only certainty available. American leadership now depended less on battlefield success and more on sustained engagement. Meanwhile, conversations about Berlin resurfaced, not as regret, but as reference. The decision not to race east was defended as humane, yet acknowledged as consequential. Berlin had become a symbol of what restraint cost, and what restraint preserved. On 27 May 1945, planning began for a Europe rebuilt under tension. Economic stability, political legitimacy, and security were discussed as inseparable, each reinforcing the other. American leaders no longer spoke of leaving, but of staying. As May drew to a close, the race to Berlin faded into memory, replaced by a longer, colder contest. The words spoken now were measured not in applause, but in endurance, and endurance would define the peace ahead. On 1 June 1945, as summer light spread across Europe, American leaders confronted the cost of delay, realizing that time itself had become a strategic weapon. The war's devastation had created urgency everywhere. Yet urgency was being answered differently on opposite sides of the continent. What America postponed, others consolidated. In Washington, Truman convened advisors to assess Europe's economic collapse. Factories silent, railways broken, currencies worthless. They understood that hunger did not wait for ideology, and desperation could redraw loyalties faster than armies ever had. Stability, not speeches, would determine allegiance. On 5 June 1945, reports from Berlin described a city reorganized under strict control. Movement regulated, information filtered, authority unquestioned. American observers noted efficiency, but also fear, the kind that discouraged dissent before it could form. These details sharpened Washington's sense of urgency. General Marshall argued that power vacuum was the true enemy, warning that absence invited domination. American leaders began shaping plans not only for recovery, but for reassurance, signaling that the United States would anchor the western half of Europe. The idea of economic aid as strategic defense quietly took shape. Meanwhile, conversations with Moscow grew increasingly formal, stripped of wartime warmth. Every phrase was weighed, every agreement footnoted, as both sides tested boundaries without crossing them. Diplomacy became a contest of patience rather than trust. On 10 June 1945, Truman acknowledged privately that the race to Berlin had ended. But the race for Europe had only begun. Military victory had provided leverage. Yet leverage required follow-through to remain meaningful. America now faced a choice between engagement and erosion. As June advanced, American leaders sensed history accelerating again. The silence after war was filling with structure, and whoever built fastest would shape the peace that followed. On 15 June 1945, as diplomatic cables crossed the Atlantic daily, American leaders felt momentum slipping if it was not actively reclaimed. The language of partnership remained. Yet the substance beneath it thinned, replaced by guarded commitments and delayed responses. Every unanswered message carried strategic weight. In Europe, American commanders reported growing confidence among Soviet authorities. Control solidifying, borders behaving less like lines and more like walls. These developments were not sudden, but their permanence was becoming clear. What had begun as wartime necessity was hardening into post-war design. On 18 June 1945, Truman reviewed assessments, comparing influence gained through combat with influence gained through reconstruction. The conclusion was unavoidable. Rebuilding created loyalty, while force created compliance. American power would now be measured by consistency, not conquest. Discussions turned toward long-term presence, bases, alliances, and economic frameworks capable of resisting political drift. Leaders recognized that retreat would not restore balance, it would erase it. The decision to remain in Europe became strategic, moral, and irreversible. Meanwhile, Berlin loomed large in memory, a reference point invoked in debates about timing and resolve. The city symbolized both restraint exercised and opportunity surrendered, a reminder etched into every policy discussion. No one spoke of reversing that decision, but everyone measured its consequences. On 22 June 1945, early outlines of coordinated recovery emerged, tentative yet ambitious. American leaders began aligning resources, institutions, and messaging around the idea of shared prosperity as defense. The foundations of a new strategy were quietly laid. As June neared its end, the race to Berlin faded fully into history. In its place stood a broader contest, one without a finish line, defined by patience, presence, and purpose rather than speed. On 6 July 1945, as leaders gathered for the Potsdam Conference, American words carried more weight than American weapons. Harry Truman arrived with quiet confidence, aware that this was his first true test on the world stage, not as a wartime successor, but as a peacetime decision-maker. The race to Berlin had shaped the seating at this table, even if no one spoke its name. In the conference rooms outside Berlin, American leaders spoke carefully, firmly, measuring each phrase against future consequences. Truman addressed Stalin with respect, yet without Roosevelt's instinct for personal accommodation, signaling a subtle shift in tone. This was not confrontation, but clarity. And clarity had been missing since victory. On 17 July 1945, discussions turned to borders, reparations, and political freedoms, subjects heavier than artillery. American leaders pressed for open processes, believing legitimacy could not be imposed by force alone. The responses they received were precise, controlled, and revealing. Behind closed doors, Truman reflected on the decisions that had led here. The choice not to race to Berlin, the acceptance of limits, the gamble on restraint. He understood now that restraint required reinforcement, or it became surrender by another name. The peace demanded presence, patience, and power exercised deliberately. As Potsdam continued, American leaders committed fully to a long-term role in Europe. The lessons of the race to Berlin were no longer abstract, they were policy. Victory had taught them that how a war ends can matter more than how it is won. When the conference concluded, the world did not feel settled. Instead, it felt defined. Lines clearer, intentions sharper. The future colder but structured. The race to Berlin was over. But the words spoken afterward would shape the next half-century.